Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and being so many of you, and thank you, of course, to the organizers of this fascinating strategic Mediterranean dialogue. Thank you for organizing this dialogue and for organizing so many fascinating debates since yesterday. In the morning, I attended a really interesting debate on disinformation, which for all citizens that we are, and in particular for all journalists, has become a very important challenge. We are lucky enough today to have among us General Baratz. He is the commander of a new group of the army that is trying to anticipate the evolution of conflict. And then we have Héloïse Fayet, who is very known to us. She is a researcher at IFRI, works on Iran in particular. And then we have Olivier Zariec from the Lyon University, and he also is the director of press collection with an interesting series of books published. I will start with you, my general. I'd like to ask you a question on the way the two simultaneous wars that we are currently faced with indirectly, but also directly in a myriad of ways. I'd like to know the way that the war in Ukraine, which is now entering its third winter with all the energy consequences that we know, and the way that the conflict in the Middle East, which this morning is still raging, I'd like to know the way these two simultaneous wars that seem so different, because in the Ukraine we have a confrontation between two states, two armies, a confrontation supported in a way by two coalitions of states, whereas in the Middle East, and this is quite a contemporary phenomenon where you're trying to anticipate the evolution of the situation, and you've known similar situations in Africa, we also have a state, an army, faced with paramilitary organizations supported by Iran. So I will start with you, and my question is, to this day, what are the lessons drawn from the war in Ukraine, according to you, in your perspective, which is the angle of the evolution of the way the army is going to lead its battles in the future? Thank you very much. So first of all, I'd like to generally talk about the lessons learned, and then slowly we'll delve into more concrete tactical aspects. The two main lessons that we can draw from the war in Ukraine is that it marks an important change of era in terms of geopolitics. We have the end of the world order as we've known it until today, the return of violent clashes between states, and disorder generally, with a world order currently being questioned even by countries that are supposed to uphold it within the Security Council. So we can tell that this new chapter that is opening is a completely new chapter compared to what we've known before. We're witnessing an increasing instability, and as you've mentioned it, instability between states as well. The recourse to violence has now become justified, apparently, to argue between states, but also we have the appearance of paramilitary groups that are heavily armed, and they benefit from technological innovation, and that is a second phenomenon that we can observe in today's conflicts. It's the acceleration of technological innovation and the appearance of dual technology that can be found easily and can be used in a military way. So it does undermine the technological benefit that we used to have. And for us in the army, we are losing a strategic asset that we used to have. We used to dominate with our tools, with our means, any adversary. And today that is not the case anymore. It is not the case anywhere, including in African theaters, where you can find drones, electronic observation tools, solar-powered tools. So we used to have domination in the air, and it isn't the case anymore. We have to take that into account. So these two trends, technological acceleration and geopolitical change, means there's a whole new chapter opening. Eloise, this proliferation of sophisticated weaponry that falls into the hands of, for example, Houthis in Yemen that are still wearing a dagger on their belt, this technological acceleration, how do you interpret it? It's very typical that what we call the mix. So we have a mix of sophisticated weapons like solar defense or missile defense capacities that are very sophisticated and much more. Much less costly technologies like drones that you can buy anywhere, for example, onto which you attach a few explosives, and that can cause a lot of damage as well. So we have this tension between the mass that is possible to reach thanks to the low cost of some technologies, which will then saturate the adversary's defenses, which in our case means the defense of our allies. So the theater in Ukraine is particularly typical of this case. The Russians can buy drones from Iran, the Shahed drones, that they then send onto the defense systems of Ukraine to target energy systems in Ukraine. And this completely depletes the anti-missile, the missile defense system of the West, including of the systems that are being delivered by the US to Ukraine. And unfortunately, these stocks are not unlimited because these are very costly systems. The same thing is happening in the Middle East with recent attacks of Israel. When you compare the cost of one Iranian ballistic missile that forces Israel to implement very costly systems like Arrow 2, Arrow 3, and additionally forces the US to use anti-ballistic missile system like the SM-3, we could see that the expenses are uncomparable in terms of cost compared to other types of weapons. And again, the question of stocks is raised. A huge part of these anti-ballistic systems can be depleted quite fast. So we have an imbalance between the offensive capabilities that are sometimes not costly at all and the cost of defense is a huge issue. This is taking place much more than before when we were just faced with terrorists. Olivier Zajac, with your perspective as a historian, you can see conflicts accelerating and spiking. How can you interpret the future? How do you see the future? Thank you for this question. Thank you to FMES and to Pascal Ausseur for your invitation. I am delighted to be here on stage to be able to discuss these issues. The question you ask might be the question of the angle to adopt when we look at these. There are two aspects. First of all, the conflicts themselves, the way they evolve, the way they take place, the type of adversaries that are facing each other, but we can understand each of these conflicts only if we place them back into their context. So there is a context on the ground. There's a geopolitical context that has to be understood in order to, first of all, understand what is taking place in front of our eyes. There are a number of filters that sometimes we do not see. And then additionally, we have to understand how we can change the way we do things. How do we negotiate? Under what conditions? The second aspect, the first one was the conflicts themselves. Second aspect, it's something that's a bit more vague. It's harder to really understand, but it does give some sort of unity in all these separate conflicts. It's the idea of the relations between these conflicts. We have to understand the ties between all the conflicts that are taking place. We have to understand the connected vessels between all these conflicts, what is taking place in the Ukraine, what is taking place in the Middle East, what used to happen in Libya, in Syria, what is happening currently again in Sahel, what is happening in Sudan, in Yemen. We have a series of conflicts taking place in the margins of Europe, in particular in the south, that are linked not only to weaponry. It's not because we have the TB2 everywhere, whether it is in Sudan or in the Sahel or in other theaters of operations in the Ukraine, and that is the case as well. It's not just because weapons are being circulated and tied together all these conflicts and allow us to understand the technological evolution. It's also about the way we use these weapons and the way we use these weapons are tied as well. In the Ukraine, for example, the way drones are being used in actions as well as in the tactical operations of the groups operating in Ukraine, it shows that there's some sort of unity in spite of the diversity of conflicts, and some sort of unity in the way they are being waged. So I think we have to adopt a different angle to understand circulation of weapons, use of weapons, the way they're being used, and the acceleration. General, before we delve upon the African theater of conflicts, because you led the Barkhane operation, one thing that shocks the citizen that I am, non-expert that I am, it's the fact that the battlefield is now becoming a battlefield of civilians. And in several ways, we can observe it in Ukraine. It's been the case for over 2.5 years. We can see it tragically also taking place in the Near East and in Lebanon in particular. Lebanon, that country that is constantly falling prey to regional ambitions. The way the war is now moving into cities, is that something that you're anticipating will become a bigger and bigger issue for the army? Indeed, there is an evolution, I think, for two main reasons. In the past, we tried to avoid cities in conflicts because it was difficult to enter cities. Nowadays, it is the main challenge, the main issue for any combat, whether it is in Ukraine, in Gaza, or in Lebanon. The city has become the theater of operation. It is the priority. Why? Well, one of the reasons is, first of all, on the Ukrainian front, it's because of what we call the transparency of the battlefield. To evade surveillance from optical sensors or acoustic sensors, cities are easier to operate in. So they have become a priority goal, or at least they have become a priority evolution theater for forces that want to evade surveillance. Secondly, we tend to forget it, but oftentimes in the past, populations have been used as a tool to get the adversary to give up more than the war itself. So using the city, when you use the city as a zone of combat, of course you involve civilians. So the idea is still to try and break the adversary's will. And that has been the case during all wars, First World War, Second World War. There's also that idea that if I bomb in the back, there won't be any more support in the front. So that illusion has not been shown to be true because it hasn't really worked out. But the idea is still present. In order to break the adversary's will, we will hurt the adversary. We will target their civilians, their populations, try to undermine the troops' morale that way. You said any war ends with a negotiation. What strikes me in contemporary wars, contemporary conflicts, we could talk about Sudan as well, which is a complete humanitarian disaster and is a power play between two generals, if I may. It seems that precisely because wars are now being led among civilians, that there are no negotiations, that we do not see on the horizon negotiations arriving. Even if, in the case of the Ukraine, one could think that with the upcoming American election and the huge uncertainty about the result of the American election, maybe eventually we are headed towards some kind of negotiation in the Ukraine. But again, for the historian that you are, how do you interpret this evolution of wars, this absence of negotiations? This is a question that has been weighing on us a lot, and weighs on the way the West has been understanding wars since at least the end of the Cold War. We have sort of reflexes that I could call strategic Alzheimer. For a while, we usually think we have found a strategic key. For example, for a while, we said that the future will reside in wars that have to be waged very intensively, very brutally. They have to be very short. That's what the Americans call overmatch in terms of power play. You have to have a huge power crushing everything else. So that was the military doctrine at the end of the 90s for the Americans. And then suddenly the situation changes completely because we have 9/11 and we go into Afghanistan, and we have quite the opposite. The idea is to win over the hearts and the minds of the population. I remember about 15 to 20 years ago, one of the first studies that the army asked me to lead was about air power and air theater. So at that time, everyone was reading again General Rupert Smith and the likely war. So we felt that cities were important, that populations were at the center of gravity, and that we were leaving technocentrism. And then suddenly the situation changes completely. We turn a new page and we realize again that major wars can be waged, that we have no more ammunition, that our goals are not being reached, that after a week, if we enter confrontation, we have our stocks depleted. So what strikes me is that we have to stop going from one doctrine to the completely other doctrine, because it has consequences as well on our budgets, on our defense capabilities, and industrial actors in the room know it better than I do. How can we somehow find a point in the middle, some kind of balance where, because we have come up with all the toughest scenarios that we could be faced with, then we would find a way to be able to maybe not respond to absolutely everything, but at least not be completely taken aback by a change of doctrine one way or another. That is a serious goal we have to set for ourselves. And I'm picking up on what you've said, is the way we understand wars. If during a war we only have goals that we express in moral ways. For example, France will not leave Sahel as long as terrorism hasn't been destroyed. That is what François Hollande has said. So morally, of course, this seems to make sense. It seems to be true, it seems to be right, but it is not strategic. Because in the end, these goals are indefinite. They do not have a strict limit. There is no limit in time for the intervention. We have unending wars because we have unending operations without politically motivated goals defined before the intervention. And we do not have a flexible approach that allows us to say we have sacrificed a certain number of soldiers, we have spent this much, we have reached these goals, we need to end the operation now. Or maybe we could be able to say we have reached limited objectives, limited goals, but they make sense politically. So we are slowly realizing that wars aren't just about operations. Wars are about political issues before all else. And yes, it always needs to end with a negotiation, but operations and wars cannot be unending. The war in Ukraine will end in the same way that other wars have ended, even if it might seem that we are engaged in a combat between the good and the evil, and the way that we envision liberal societies in Europe. But it cannot mean that this is enough to just keep the war going. We'll have to end it eventually. And this brings me to my last point on our values. We have to understand our values, our interests, and tie our values and interests with the way that we wage war and how we limit our wars. So my added value as a historian is just to remind that every war has to end, and it cannot end if it doesn't have politically defined goals.
Athena?
So I see that you have the goddess Athena on the emblem of your uniform, and of course she is emblematic of cunning. And to echo what Olivier and Jeg have just said, the issue is public opinion. And of course there has been a very interesting discussion this morning about misinformation. We see to what extent both Russia and China, which are today the two big misinformation superpowers in contemporary wars, how do you, in your command, how do you anticipate the emergence of generative AI and the deep changes in public opinion brought about by our opponents, and indeed our opponents on the ground in the long term? So I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily a problem in our democracies, but we must be aware that it can be manipulated or influenced. It is indeed a major topic, and how can we prepare ourselves for the emergence of these techniques, these old propaganda techniques, which have already been well conceived during the era of the Soviet Union and in the post-war periods. And of course now, it has found new tools with social media, AI, which allows us to mine open sources and therefore to find new cognitive methods which have been developed by the Russians since 2014 during their first incursion into Ukraine, where they have tried to undermine the frontline troops by their actions on social media via the families of the soldiers in order to demoralize their families and therefore their soldiers, and also to increase the tensions between the frontline units and the commands, because that was always the major topic during combat. There's always a distance between the frontline units and the high-level commands. The frontline units always being critical of the high-level command because they consider that they are running the risk of their lives, whereas the command is safe. And so this could induce the opponent to make mistakes. And so we are worried, and there will be this kind of manipulation, and we have seen a certain number of them during the last few months, where all the recent events have been harnessed by the propagandists in order to undermine European popular opinion. And it is a very classic tactic of the Russian army, which is always to undermine the rear bases of your opponents, whether it is the population or their supports. High-intensity conflicts is making us rediscover total war, i.e. we engaging the population, engaging all of our resources. On the Russian side, for example, they have organized their industry in order to be able to hold over the long term. We've seen on the Ukrainian side, we see that what they are depending on is the support from Westerners and Western industry. And so we need to think about our preparedness for the world to come is what we do on our own national soil. beyond, of course, our equipment, its ability to rapidly produce them and in an independent manner. In this kind of war, which has an industrial component, the industrial power is going to be a determinant of who has the most power. And so in order to destabilize and to create a fault line in the alliance behind Ukraine, the Russians are deploying a lot of efforts. And if we need to prepare for major conflicts, or perhaps we could even avoid it by showing that we are sufficiently strong and to implement a deterrent. We need to demonstrate that we have this ability to fight in the information field, so that we can counter misinformation, to reestablish the truth, which is very difficult today. And we see here that we also have a societal problem around who are the influences in society who have a credibility in the face of all this misinformation circulating on social media. In the past, it was quite straightforward. We had, the teacher. The teacher used to hold the truth, but now authority and truth is being undermined permanently, and this is a reality that we're having to confront, and we're working on it within the army. We're trying to identify the frailties we have within our units, what kind of social media they are using to find information. The youth no longer watches television; they get their information from social media. And we want to be able to monitor what is going on in order to make sure they're not being exposed to this kind of high-level misinformation. So we no longer believe teachers, but we believe experts. Or perhaps we are wrong to do this so, but of course not in your case. With regards to this juxtaposition of on-site means of production, we've seen that the Ukrainians who were already at a high level of technological preparedness at the time when they were working on this well before the war, and they used to work a lot for the Russians in this area. And we see this capability that they have had to produce their own drones. And we also see how in Ukraine and also in the Near East, this juxtaposition between means which seem to be artisanal and extremely sophisticated weapons, which are extremely costly, is this difference in these wars, which are highly intense. Does it exaggerate the balance of power between the protagonists? So I'd just like to respond to something that Olivier said before answering a question. I rather like your expression, there's geopolitical Alzheimer's, or strategic Alzheimer's. And it reminds me of an expression used by Olivier Schneid to realize to what extent we are referring to very old concepts to qualify France's foreign affairs today, whereas when it's not actually true in light of the current geopolitical context. We realize that every 10, 15 years, there are concepts which we thought we'd forgotten and which come back to light today. And to avoid that, we need to have a strategic relay. And I'm very pleased that we have so many young people in the auditorium here who are taking interest in these topics. And I'm glad that the RSMed is encouraging the presence of so many young people. And I hope they will make the most of these young 2 days. So long as, of course, there will be sufficient financing for them one day to be able to have a permanent position, university or academic positions. With regards to this juxtaposition of fairly artisanal capabilities and very sophisticated weapons, I think we'd even widen this concept out to something which is very pregnant in current conflicts, and which we see a lot in Ukraine and in the Near East, and which the general has slightly mentioned. It's the permeability between the state level in the army and what is happening in the army. And I know this afternoon there is a roundtable dedicated to the defense economy, and so I'm sure they'll go into it in more detail then. But the Ukrainians' capacity for innovation is extremely impressive. They work in very short cycles because they are faced with a threat which forces them to react in this way. They have small-scale laboratories with feedback loops which are a lot shorter than what they have in France, which allows them to be very reactive and to offer innovations in terms of drones and missiles and intelligence gathering and civilians as well, and of course which raises a question in terms of the law of armed conflict, but which can be applications which can be turned into sensors, apps which allow them to geolocalize Russian positions, and then it ends up in a short feedback loop to the targeting groups, and these are adaptations to the context of an immediate war, and which is in contrast with the Russian army, which has inherited the old-fashioned Soviet doctrine, and which will probably lead the Russians to lose is their inability or the difficulty of doing this retext and this feedback in order to improve their tactics and their weapons to adapt to what they're experiencing on the ground in Ukraine. So there's this adaptability between the army and the private sector, which is very recent and new. We see this in the connectivity on the battlefield with Starlink. Elon Musk's system was employed right from the first few months of the conflict by the Ukrainians to allow them to have a redundancy in their comm systems. Finally, it was politicized by Musk, who realized that it could potentially expose him to Russian reprisals. And so he had to ask permission from Trump, and he refused. He refused for Crimea, and then it was used in Ukraine. So there are issues which are raised in terms of dependency on these private actors, and we see this as well in the Middle East with this mix between ad hoc tools which can be bought on the black market, spare parts which can be bought in Korea or in Russia, and they can make their drones with these parts, whereas more westernized countries, so Israel is apart because they have an extremely reactive defense industry, but other countries might find it very difficult to design these kind of very reactive systems. But what you can see within the army in France and in the Navy and in the Air Force, there are laboratories which are being created to foster innovation within the armed forces, because the people who are best able to be aware of what they need are the forces on the ground who are in contact with the enemy on a daily basis. So I would like to respond to the fact that Ukrainians owe a lot to us, but the Ukrainians have evolved a lot, and so have the Russians, compared to the first few months of the operations. They're using, for example, old Russian bombs, and they're adapting them by adding wings to them. They're pretty good at DIY and adapting their tools, and so there is teamwork going on there. We mustn't caricature the Russians too much, because the Russians are evolving quite a lot, which also challenges us. They are also innovating, and their industry is progressing a lot, especially in terms of the remote-operated munitions and self-guided munitions, which are starting to appear. And so the armies are adapting to the context, and we see the challenges which we face through the transparency of the battlefield, where we see that there is such a proliferation of sensors, be they in space or on land or in the air. It is very difficult today to hide your troops, which means that most of the battlefields are widening out, and to become a lot deeper. There is very little force concentration. Forces are concentrating more along their rear lines in order to then come forward by surprise. And so what we're seeing is a real transformation of our capabilities, because the battlefield is profoundly changing beyond the fact that the urban areas are becoming major challenges. And there's also the fact that the opponent is far and far away, and his logistics bases and its force concentration is further and further away, so you need to be able to strike it from further away. And we also see the emergence of a fundamental aspect of a military capability is AI, which you mentioned earlier. Today, we are able to obtain this mix of old tools which are able to make very highly performing thanks to AI. For example, with drones, which is a major issue for our units, the technical section of the Land Army has taken its old 20mm cannon and has added an AI camera to it with an algorithm, and today they have a tool which can launch a drone at 1 kilometer in a very precise manner. So it's very encouraging. We see that AI is making us able to transform very old tools in now very high-performance tools. And so this is where we're seeing this transformation of our capability starting to take hold progressively but surely. And this will have strong implications for our own capabilities. And we're working, of course, with the expert centres, with the DGA, the Army's procurement arm. With regards to your opponent, you need to be able to have a very long outlook in terms of the variety of them. There are states, but we're seeing more and more non-state actors who are intervening in lethal ways in contemporary conflicts, be they civilian or military. Absolutely, and it is one of the major constraints in our choice of capabilities, which is unlike our American friends who have two armies. One, the army, which is really made for high-intensity warfare to confront an equivalent army on the battlefield. For them, tomorrow's battlefield, the first contact will be robots and drones, which will be in contact with the enemy, and the human being will be just behind and will come to harness the rupture made by the robots and the drones. So the army is working on that. And then they have the Marines, who are still in an expeditionary force mindset with intermediary conflicts with counter-insurrection forces, or to face the asymmetrical threats like the Houthis or others. And so they have that kind of capability. We have only one army to carry out all these missions, and so we need to maintain this versatility. And of course, this has a cost. Certainly, what it means is we need to give up on a certain number of needs, and it is therefore fairly complex, and also requires us to prepare our soldiers to this plasticity and to this versatility, because a capability is not just due to equipment, it is also soldiers who are using them. And we see that in this harder and harder battlefield, which is going to require units which are more and more spread out on the ground, we have a much greater need for cohesion, group cohesion, which of course is a specificity of the army, which means that you go to fight with your comrades. Tomorrow, that will be much less the case, so we need to change the way that we work with our men. And we're looking at a certain number of avenues, especially in terms of mental preparedness, which I think will become as important as physical preparedness in the years to come. Olivier, you have worked a lot on Africa in particular. You mentioned it this morning several times over. What lessons have you learned from these wars? The general will, of course, be able to talk about his own lived experience, but as a theoretical analyst, what lessons can you draw from those wars, which we have a fairly ambiguous memory of? Memory? The stakes are still there. The challenges are still there. Serval, the victory, a clear victory, which lent huge credibility to French forces. The land army reached all its objectives, and there has been a victory on a tactical and operational level. In terms of this tactical and operative success into a political success, that is something else. And this is not automatic. And so the question is how we convert this temporary win when the army has won tactically and operationally. Do we know how to transform this into a political gain? We need to know how to face up to this, maybe politically, or realize how we've managed to maybe not make the most of the initial gains, and that really is the preserve of the politicians or politics. Now, what we need to do is we need to decenter ourselves from Africa, or focus elsewhere from Africa, to look at the chain of conflicts. What we find is bits of Ukraine, bubbles of Ukraine, emerging permanently in African conflicts, not just in terms of weapon transfers, but in terms of usage, operational and tactical innovations, the short loop feedback, and the ability of non-state groups today to make the most of know-how and skills. For example, command and control centers, which are decentralized in the field. We did not imagine them being able to implement this just a few years ago. So in terms of these contemporary conflicts, it should lead us to think about what we mean by artisanal, which is a word that we hadn't used up until now. And it is a word which is a part of the army, especially whether it is the individual training of the soldier or certain habits which we have doing perhaps a lot with very limited means. And I would like to reposition this with regards to our opponents. We used to imagine a certain category of opponents, probable or imagined, would work in this artisanal way, that their lack of knowledge or their lack of high-level capabilities would be something that we could deal with. But in the last 20 years, we have gone from a purely political reality to realizing that hardiness for these actors is just something that they are making do with on a temporary basis, because whilst waiting for better, and especially for its relevance for the current and future actions of our armies, not just in France, is that we have the catch-up of these actors in Africa. And what we realize is that with these opponents who are increasing their capacity, who are hardening, who have now symmetrical capacities, who are now able to use weapons which we thought only Europeans or Westerners used to be able to use, it will not be sufficient to be innovative in the tactical field. We need to realize, yes, there are capabilities which are very expensive. Now, then we're talking about drones, micro-drones, and so on. Yes, of course, but because these opponents are rising up in this spectrum of sophistication, it is not a question of volume of expense, but it's a question of a return on your investments. If we want to invest in the technological drivers of ballistics, anti-missile defenses, the third dimension, ability to strike deep, we will let go, we will give up on what gave us our specific capabilities. We will abandon what used to be, or what is, in fact, our strength, which maintains us in the race and which allows us to be able to project ourselves. And of course, we also need innovation and creativity. And there was a great document which was produced by the army well before the war in Ukraine, published in 2015, called Actions for the Future. And this document was not sufficiently read. I'm very interested in doctrines. I compare them between countries, between different historical periods, etc. And for me, this document is a model, because in this document we have the obviously the constant factors of war, but we also had the operational aspects. We had return of the mass, the requirement to replace equipment and men and to be able to continue over time. And then in terms of the objectives, in terms of the depth of reach, which allows us to respond to the depth of the battlefield on a tactical and operational level, the mass and the and agility, and also the layers of influence. And what we found there, everything that we have today. But the question is what we do simultaneously in terms of the investment at all these different levels. We need to do it all at once and not do it step by step. We must not give up on something and focus only on what the needs of the most recent conflict have shown. And what we see in these conflicts, which are also all interconnected, and that's also why we need European cooperation, is that we cannot allow ourselves to turn a blind eye to one part of the spectrum in favor of another. Okay, some will say what we'll do is we'll invest everywhere, but we'll be good, we will excel nowhere. But how will we invest, not just for our army, which is of course has a lot of commitments today and needs to think about the future, but how do we reflect not just for the land army, but for the Air Force and the Navy? Do we need to be able to invest in technology, or do we need to invest or do we need to have a new realistic approach on a tactical operational level, looking at what's going on in Ukraine? I think we must not have to choose between options. We have to have this national and collective ambition to not choose. When you look at Africa and its evolution, how the evolution we see in the Sudan, in the Sahel, the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, what we see there is that it will not stay at this artisanal level which we were used to up until now. The stakes are rising, and we are not ready. So I think that what the army is doing today in terms of prospecting, and which ends up not turning a blind eye to anything, I think that is the lesson of the current theatres of operation. Okay, so not neglect anything, but we still need to set priorities because the means are not infinite. So no, they're not infinite, but nevertheless there are solutions. And so that is one of the projects which we have this year, is to work on how we can balance the land army's capabilities and how we can respond to all these changes in operational capacities of our adversaries, and how can we refine our model. And today I will talk about artificial intelligence. I strongly believe that we can fairly quickly fill some of our lack of means through using artificial intelligence. I have been able to visit our state research institutions, and where we have exceptional technological tools which cost very little, and that is what this is allowing us, what artificial intelligence is now allowing us to do. There is a lot of pressure within the chiefs of staff is to do both. On the one side, to continue to have classic weapons programs which will require long-term investment, and then alongside much more reactive actions, things which can be bought off the shelf, which can then be developed, things which will perhaps not last more than 4 or 5 years, because we know that the change in technology will be so rapid that after 4 years it will already be obsolete. when you look at the Ukrainians currently believe that in terms of drones, they need to adapt every 3 months to the Russian countermeasures. So there are very much areas where there's no point investing in long-term programs, and we need to be much more flexible or agile. And so that is the transformation that is happening within the Army's capabilities, is this movement towards one part of the investment being much more agile, based on innovation, based on the creativity of the units who have specific needs that they will make the Army aware of. And that will be part of a larger doctrine where we will combine all of this. What makes a difference when we are on operation is just not one piece of equipment. It is not the quality of one piece of equipment, but it is the combination of various equipments and various capabilities which allow us to make the difference and to have a higher tempo than that of our opponents, because a war is always an issue of tempo. It's always been the same, and it was already the case in the 1940s, where we had better quality tanks than the Germans, better quality planes, but we weren't able to combine communications tanks and aircraft to have this superior power production. So I think we need to think about how we can integrate these tools and these very low-cost tools into our general doctrines and the way in which we work.
Eloise, the issue is that that agility and that change to low-cost equipment is commonly shared with adversaries, whether they're real adversaries or potential ones. Yes, but it's not necessarily a problem as long as us, and I mean by that NATO and the allies, are focused on our defense, on breaching mass, and on our doctrine. As I said, once new weaponry is created, it's not just about getting it, buying it, but it's also about using it smartly. And that is something that Western armies, but also China and other big state powers might have more ability to do, because they have a military institution that can come up with maybe more rigid but more sustainable means, ways of using these new weapons, which in the end still, I think, will let these powers keep their superiority over other partners. Last thing, often we say that the French army is spread out. Sometimes we talk about a club strategy where France is trying to remain in every single club, the one of nuclear deterrence, the one of cyber warfare, the one of space, the one of aircraft carriers. That could be a strategy that can be criticized, but I agree with the general in the sense that we have allies that are close to us and have chosen to focus on a certain capacity. They have decided to focus on certain types of missions, and they regret it. I'm thinking of particularly, I'm sorry if you're in the room, but of the United Kingdom that has human resources issues and capacity issues at the moment, and regrets having made that choice of focusing on expeditions, on missions. So in the longest possible term, we have to focus on the one hand on missions, on expeditions, but also on our approaches as France on the eastern flank, but also on the national territory. And that is actually a recent trend, I think, within the land forces and the army. It has been strengthened recently. We've seen during the Olympic Games it has worked really well, but we have to work on the role of land forces for the protection of the national territory. And then additionally, the important thing, of course, is Europe. This morning in this room, there was a roundtable on Europe. How can we better spread capacity on the European level, on NATO's level, whether our French allies like it or not? I don't think our land forces need 1,000 tanks. However, if our Polish partners feel the need to buy so many of them, it's because they're very close to the Russian threat. And that could be a way of better spreading capacity on the European level in terms of capacity of stocks of ammunition, in terms of all the strategic enablers, in terms of missile defense as well. So the huge issue is we need to better spread capacity on the European level without neglecting our own sovereignty. Of course, this is a tough balance to find, but that is what we need to progress on on the European level, on the level of bilateral agreements, and on the level of NATO. So we have the best defense possible, and we can use offensive means as well. The general earlier was talking about the importance of depth. That is something we're rediscovering in France and on the European level, because China is getting ready. The Middle East has those means already, Russia even more so. And so one day, eventually, we'll have to accept that we'll need to become a little more offensive. Also, the maybe not the loss, but the reduction of aerial superiority means that ballistic missiles are making a comeback, and eventually we'll have to accept that we'll need to hit our adversary and their systems before they hit us. So, General, hitting the adversary before they hit us, that is a golden rule, of course, a rule of thumb, but are you able to anticipate? Are you able to anticipate with other European groups?
Est-ce que on sait les mésaventures?
Do we know what mistakes have been made on the industrial level? All the binational, trinational programs that unfortunately do not function sufficiently well. Let's say it that way. So, in your new position, leading the land forces, in terms of anticipation of future conflicts, do you coordinate with your European partners, with your European counterparts? Yes, there is a will to coordinate. Indeed, we are in touch with the Germans. Their structure is slightly similar to ours, but not completely. We are in touch with the British as well, the Dutch, the Belgians, of course, because the Belgians chose a complete integration of a Belgian brigade into a French unit, which is quite rare, which also means we have responsibilities towards our Belgian partner, because they have decided to use French equipment, the French doctrine, and to work as if they were a French brigade. I think it is a very unique, it's a one-off example in Europe, and we'd like to replicate it elsewhere. That could be a model that our industrial actors could replicate as well. When I talk about our capacity to produce, we can see that there's a problem in terms of market size as well. If we could export our equipment, that would make our production chains more sustainable. So for us, it is important to try and help our industrial partners to find new markets and to export towards other armies as well. We are in touch a lot with the Americans as well. They are the basic example, model. They have inspired our model for a command of the future. What I realize is that everyone agrees on what is taking place at the moment in terms of how conflicts are evolving. We agree mostly on the solutions to prioritize. However, as you emphasized it earlier, there's a big difficulty on the European level. It's the industrial actors. Sometimes they struggle to talk to each other. We have very different models. For example, with the Germans, we can tell how powerful the German industry is. The German industry almost imposes its equipment on the German army. The German army is quite passive when it comes to choosing its equipment, and the German industry is very much interested in exporting. So we do not have the same industrial basis as our German partners, which sometimes explain why we're struggling to understand each other. It's not just because we have a political agreement that we will be in agreement on the industrial level. So that is where the difficulty resides. In the solutions to prioritize, it's we have to talk about how to redistribute industrially And that's when the issue of job creation is raised, and that also can create difficulties between states. We share our concerns regularly with our partners. We are starting to find common ground, including with Eastern countries, among which the Baltic states, with whom we have strong ties. We have a lot of exchanges with them, a lot of feedback is being shared with them. So a whole network is being set up at the moment. It is getting structured slowly. But if you ask me if tomorrow we'll have a French tank on the European market, I cannot say I am sure of it. Well, maybe not a French tank, but we can tell that we can see the Caesar cannon has gained ground on the battlefield. Olivier, to pick up on what you were saying regarding this difficulty that we have because we have so many priorities. At one point, eventually, we need to decide on an order of priorities. And when we do it ahead of time, what does it look like? What would be your absolute top priority? If I had to choose one, clearly, if I had an top absolute priority, I think I would already be Director General, but that is not what I am trying to do or to be, and I leave Emmanuel in that position, and he does it brilliantly, and it is not easy. There's a character in Game of Thrones that says chaos is a ladder. So we can have a ladder, we can feel that priorities are all on the same level, we do not know where to start, we do not have any means. Our natural partners, in the case of NATO and Europe, they do not look in the same direction. Some look towards the south, some towards the east. We are trying to find a new point of balance so that we do not neglect anything in spite of the emergency. And the emergency for a majority of our partners right now is the Ukraine, and it is also the priority for the EU. That is a heavy geopolitical reality. But in the midst of this chaos, if no absolute priority seems to emerge, we can still define a few levels of priorities. But that can only be done, and that has to be done collectively, hand in hand with our European partners, without forgetting to always coming back to the lesson drawn from COVID, because we didn't talk enough about it, but it was a strategic event, including for our armies. COVID was a strategic event. We shouldn't forget the absolute necessity of autonomy. We have to be more interoperable, but also more autonomous. And sometimes it's difficult to choose between these two priorities. So there's a ladder of priorities, but it can only be defined if we take a long view. In the past, and it was done by the General Direction for Weaponry, we were talking about it recently with a member of DGA, it was the Prospective Plan over 30 years, the PP30 in France. It's a program that existed, that functioned. There was a part that was confidential and a part of the plan that was quite public, that everyone could read. And then eventually we stopped having that vision over 30 years for an obvious reason. We felt that things were changing too fast, that 30 years was too long, that we couldn't have 5-year plans even anymore, that the situation changed very fast and that we needed to be more agile and reacting immediately. What I say is quite obvious, but I say it because I'm wondering if we actually realize it on a daily basis. So in these very short timelines that we're used to now, we're used to having, in all armies, we're used to having the conduct of operations disrupting plans. So eventually we think that we do not even need to plan anymore because plans are always disrupted. So that is the current reality, and the priorities end up being the priorities that are the immediate emergencies in cooperation with our partners. And it seems to me, it's an opinion that can be debated, I think this is not the right way to do things or see things. We cannot just because the current reality is chaotic and that the future is uncertain. We cannot stop defining prospective goals, in particular when it comes to intensity, to resilience of armies. We cannot neglect having long-term goals or long-term visions. So we need to establish priorities. I think the priority right now should be that we need to come back so that we can fight in the long term. So we need to produce, we need to reach mass, and we can temporarily stop talking about only weapons. We have to talk about men and women, about armies. Mass is about recruitment, about loyalty. It's about having armies that complete each other and that are sustainable. And at the moment, I think we need to raise the alarm when it comes to that. I do not want to worry you, but it is the case. Yes, indeed, conflicts is about weapons, their usage, doctrines, immediate reflexes, our capacity to equip ourselves fast. And DGA was quite a pioneer these last few years in this field. Of course, all of these elements are important, but another important thing is that we need to have men and women to implement all of this. And that should be a European priority. We do not recruit enough. We do not have enough retention. And we do not pay enough attention to what is at the heart of the armies, which is the military staff personnel. I think we are creating a few callings in this room. General, what is the timeline? It seems that 30 years seems to be an indefinite timeline at the moment. But when we talk about the command of the future, what's the timeline that you envisage? 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years? Just one thing to pick up on recruitment on staff. It is a constant worry, of course, at least for land forces. This year, land forces have had a good retention rate, maybe too good sometimes. What do you mean by too good? Well, we have people staying in our ranks longer than we thought they would, especially in the higher ranks, like colonels and above. And recruitment is excellent. Well, beware, all colonels in the room. It's quite surprising, actually. We have a higher mobilization. And in terms of recruitment, we're doing well, but it is something we constantly pay attention to because we see that we're going to have an age gap if we look at the demographic evolution. And of course, the pool of recruitment is going to shrink. So we will run into difficulties. Defense is not just about the army. So what worries us the most, what occupies us the most is how can we make sure the entire French population understands the stakes of the defense capabilities. And thank you for allowing us to share these issues, because an army doesn't make sense if there is not a population behind it willing to have that army fight for it. So besides just the mass of recruitment, we need to have a mass of popular support as well. I just wanted to make that comment to say that we are paying attention to our staff, but we are also paying a lot of attention to how we can communicate on our stakes, how we can make sure the general population understands our issues, understands what we're doing, and how we can best prepare to fight against, for example, propaganda operations or disinformation missions. And then when it comes to the timeline, well, we have two types of timeline at the moment. We are working on a timeline up to 2040, 2050 to analyze the big tendency, the big trends of conflicts. And we can see, for example, that robotics is gaining ground, also for a reason of mass. And that is one of the difficulties encountered by the US Army. These robotics are having civilian use, so in order to produce mass, robotics and the increased use of drones is being observed. Connection allows us to go faster, to collect data, to exploit data faster, but connection comes with its own weaknesses. So these are the large trends that are being observed on the long term, and then on the short term, up to 2027, the goal of the land forces is to be able to deploy a mission by 2027. A complete division with its own stocks and logistical means and surveillance and intelligence means as well. So that is our ambition, and we are currently taking a look at the land forces model. That's what we call the DORES, the doctrine of mobilization, of training, of support of the forces, because that is what makes equipment useful. And we are refining our model. We inherited deflation, and we see that now our nation has made budgetary efforts to strengthen our capacities. So we are now propping up our capacities. We had an imbalance before that. So we're refining this whole model. We're turning towards new jobs as well, because our military staff are going to be trained in different positions. For example, more electronic related jobs, missions, with the electromagnetic field being used for surveillance. So the jobs themselves are evolving, and we have to plan for that for the next 3 years. So these are the two different timelines that are being implemented in parallel, but not so much, because 2027 has to be taken into account when we look at the timeline for 2040, 2050 as well. I think time has come to ask the audience if they have any questions to raise. Please introduce yourself if you have a question to ask, and also indicate whom you address your question to. Please do not make any comment. Just ask short questions. Who wants to start? Yes, please, you can get up, please. Please go ahead. Unfortunately, without a microphone, it is impossible for the interpreter to hear the speaker. My name is Didier Loras from Agence France Presse. You mentioned artificial intelligence, and you said you were convinced that it could allow us to catch up after a lot of delays. The question I would like to ask is the following. If it is true for you, it is true for everyone. So is it possible that AI might eventually make everyone be on the same page? Will we eventually have everyone having the exact same capacity because of AI, so there won't be the asymmetry will be a terms of an issue of mass and production? Initially, I mentioned the return of intensity and of all-out wars. We can see it in the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. That question of industrial might is very pregnant. AI is about algorithms, yes, but you have to train them. So the big difference between algorithms is the quality of the data that is fed to them. You can easily find algorithms, open source algorithms, but then it's not that easy to actually train the algorithms so that they can produce something useful or intelligent. One could imagine that we are headed towards a unified world that's unified by AI. I actually don't believe it. There will be gaps. that is unavoidable because AI systems are not trained in the same way. We have some engineers are more advanced, more sophisticated in that field, and it's not just about calculation power. And an AI will also lead to another topic. It is about the consumption, energy consumption. If we use Google's model, so we have to indiscriminate use of data, will need so much power that we won't actually succeed. So we have to choose useful data and make sure algorithms are low consumption. And these are fields of research that are not of so much interest to the general public, but are very important. Another question, please go ahead. Hello. I have a question to ask General Baratz. I am a journalist. Could you please bring the mic closer to your mouth? Is this better? Laura Magavri, I am a journalist on the ground. Earlier we talked about innovation. What I've seen personally on the ground is that some things that work in the spirit of our land forces, for example, small models, focusing on lots of elements at the same time. It's a little bit of tinkering. I'm sorry, this is a very pragmatic comment, but I had chatted with someone working in innovation, and I'd realized that sometimes they tinker in their own workshops, and that product they were building could have been really useful to the entire army, but just because of how difficult it is to ask for financing, for credits, for support, they weren't doing it. So should you be finding ways to make these systems work better, to make these tools be more used on the ground? So it's not just about financing, it's also about regulation. France is particularly good in regulating and making everything difficult. So these are two topics on which we are working. First of all, to help people innovating on the ground. First of all, financing, because often this is about low-cost innovation, and regulation, which sometimes is regulation that is our own fault. We love to make our lives difficult. So we are trying to make regulations a little more flexible. Do you have another question? I find the audience quite shy this morning. If the questions on the screen are very far from us, Eloise, could you read them out? Because I think you have better glasses than I do. Well, I do not know which one to choose. You can choose whichever you want. The increased use of drones and of very fast missiles are picking up in current wars. Traditional land forces, will they still have a role to play in future conflicts? Well, first of all, the use of cyber, the use of very fast missiles and of drones, those are usages that are actually implemented by traditional land forces at the moment. But it depends what term you use when you talk about traditional or conventional land forces, but usually it is conventional forces, not just special forces, that are using these tools at the moment and these systems. So, of course, terrestrial land forces, conventional land forces will still have a role to play in future conflicts. We've mentioned it before, mass is essential in terms of humans as well. As we've said, it will never be able to replace a soldier, will never be able to replace a pilot or a rider or any other soldier in the land forces. So what is very important to do, and I think that is the challenge for the land forces and aerial forces, marine forces a little less because they rely more on platforms, which is less the case for land forces. They need to find a balance between how to keep playing an important role, how to keep making sure soldiers play an important role, while making sure they can use all of these new tools. How can we give land forces an important strategic role? And that can be done using these new tools, these new capacities, using terrestrial targets and ballistic missiles, land ballistic missiles that could be implemented eventually in the land forces. So for me, there is no inconsistency between future conflicts and land forces. That is precisely why we have this concept of the command of the future. It's to try and articulate this better in the future. General, do you have an additional comment? Yeah, we shouldn't also fall prey to the illusion of technology, because let's come back to the basics of wars. Wars are about confrontation between two wills, and it's about showing determination. The adversary will always adapt to our own system. We can see it with Gaza, and with Hezbollah in South Lebanon. They know what the Israeli military might is. They see it on a daily basis, and they've worked around it by building tunnels on hundreds, thousands of kilometers to escape, to evade surveillance, and keep hitting Israel without being exposed. So we can tell that if we fall prey to the illusion of technology at all costs, we will miss something, because unfortunately, in the end, war is a human affair. War is a human affair that goes way back in time, that has always existed. So eventually, if a nation wants to show its determination, it will have to commit soldiers on the ground to show that it is determined to win, to impose its will, or to make the adversary fold. So at one point, we will have to go through that, and eventually the adversary will adapt. And if we only use technologies, then the adversary will go into tunnels, and that's where we'll have to go. And for the moment, we don't have robots to go there. Drones can't go. We have tools that we're starting to build up, but they will work around our might, whatever it is. They will use civilians as well. And there again, we have a technological problem, because we need to have the tools that are able to distinguish between civilians and military personnel.
Olivier, is there a question you'd like to answer? So from Eloise, if I could also respond to what the General has said. For the moment, we talked a lot about the army and decisions taken by military staff, but let's not forget that the army is under the control of politicians, and so there is this dialectic of wills, and the political will needs to integrate into a coherent foreign affairs policy. And to come back to setting priorities, and of course this comes into play with budgets and the army budget, and this needs to be, these priorities need to be established by the political wing, and there is a fear of priority because there is a fear of getting it wrong. If I choose this, then maybe I will neglect drones or quantic or something less technological. And that is something which I think we really need to be aware of. I think we'd like there to be a lot more open debate in our parliament and at the Senate. And of course, there is the moment of voting the Military Planning Act. But in the end, the debates are fairly limited, and so the choices end up being made in very small committees. And I'm sure, the army does what it does very well, but it is the tool of a strategic entity which is defined by politics and which has lacked clarity over the last decades. The problem of politicians in a democracy is the long-term vision, or the impossibility of the long term. I think you've seen the failure of Russia with respect to Ukraine, and yet Russia is not a democracy. So they had not foreseen that over the long term, that Ukraine would be able to resist. And we're talking a lot about the Chinese threat, but for the moment, the Chinese do not have an expeditionary force. So I think we tend to perhaps overestimate our own democratic weaknesses. Olivier? There are lots of questions now. Hi. So first of all, many thanks for these various interventions. You've talked about striking the enemy before being hit yourselves. But for the moment, the strategy is very much along the lines of second strike and defense. Have you talked about this issue of being the first to strike as being a new objective of the army, and should we rethink French strategic doctrine? At least, is it an ambition of the army or not? Yes, I had used that expression. I really didn't want to speak on behalf of the army, but of course it is this necessity at the the level of chiefs of the staff to win the war before the war, and is a desire to modulate the information environment so that the first entry should happen in a much more flexible way, and that we shouldn't have to end up with a conflict. But there is also this issue of strikes. You will think that I'm obsessed with this subject, but we published a study at the IFRI, which will be soon available as download on the internet, but it is something that we can think about at the moment in Ukraine and in Russia. And of course, there's the whole debate about removing the constraints on the weapons which we are delivering to Ukraine, with, of course, the fear of escalation and, of course, of the Russian nuclear behind that. But we see that for Ukraine to win or to arrive at an end of conflict sufficient to be able to have satisfactory negotiations for Ukraine, we need to be able to damage the industrial military Russian complex, and so we need to be able to strike ballistic missile sites, launching sites, often mobile sites, knowing that these systems are being used to strike Ukraine. The Air Force has never prevented itself doing kinetic strikes against a group of jihadists in Africa if we had enough intelligence to know that they were perhaps going to attack French or Malian interests or whatever the allied African country is. So for me, it's not so much a redefinition of the doctrine, but in terms of the doctrine of the army, of course, I will hand over to the general. So, of course, no, we're not going to question French strategic doctrine. No, we have not yet envisaged preventive conflict. It's not on the agenda. However, in terms of deep strikes, that's what we need in the tactical domain when we engage in combat. Of course, we need to be able to strike before being hit. And that is the whole strategy of implementing, which bring together all the battlefield sensors with the means of strike. So it is something that the Americans are working on very hard, and the French army is also working on this, is how to implement faster decision-making between the moment we found a target and the moment you're able to strike it. Good morning. My question is for the general. There is an elephant in the room, which we haven't mentioned yet. When the war in Ukraine started, the first reaction of the Russians was to bomb the airports. When Ukraine launched an offensive in direction of Kursk, they destroyed the airports first. We also see that in Israel, one of the Hezbollah's targets and of Iran, because we know the two are in fact aligned, so Iran rather than Hezbollah, they tried to attack the Sahel military air bases. Do you not think that we would need to improve the ability of our air engineers in order to be able to prevent this kind of issue in case of total war, which I believe will happen one day or another? Yes, in terms of the abilities of the air engineers, I don't think it is the most fragile part of our systems, but if we can, first of all, avoid being hit, that is the best, and that is the principle of our doctrine is, first of all, avoid being hit. And if you then need to repair, then we will use the tools necessary. And we are currently looking at all the capacities, but there are some topics before the air engineering which we need to work on before that. So anti-missile defense in particular. Air defense and missile defense is, of course, a major part of this. And we've seen the development of these strategies of denial of access. And it is this denial of access which today are achieved sometimes with tools which we didn't imagine usually in Ukraine, and perhaps it is one of the major victories in Ukraine, which is not claimed by it, but it is the freedom of transit across the Black Sea. They have managed to create a fairly exceptional denial of access there. And these denial of accesses will develop, and we need to know how to break them if ever we are faced with an opponent who is controlling this denial of access, like the Houthis, for example. Olivier, one last question, perhaps? We have some questions here, but perhaps it is better to take questions in the room. We don't see you very well. And the microphone needs to be able to reach them. And I think it will be the last question. Hi. I'm a student at Lyon University. You talk about the air defense dome. I would like to know what France's position is in terms of the European anti-missile system. I think it's one of your students who's trying to trap you, Olivier. I can hear some laughter around here. But you need to realize that this is a question which is causing some people to lose quite a lot of sleep. Several years ago, during a meeting which was a bit like this one, in a less diversified, we didn't have all of civil society and so on. We had the French chief of staff who was saying that for me, the anti-missile shields, do we really need it? We have a nuclear deterrent. So I don't believe that we need a belts and braces approach. When you have one, you don't need the other. And in fact, the anti-missile defense will weaken the nuclear deterrent. But it's been a long time that we stopped thinking like this, and the anti-missile defense is completely integrated in the different layers of conventional deterrent, nuclear deterrent, the difficult to define space which is between the two, which is at stake today. Anti-missile defense is today fundamental for France, for Europe, and the way in which Europe positions itself compared to its main strategic support, which is the USA, who send part of their weaponry to Europe and which serves to protect the European continent. And so for the European continent, well, first of all, do the Europeans control the technology, the decisions, the alert systems, the warning systems? How do they really fully control these missile defense systems? So a certain number of powers are investing in this, the Americans first and foremost, but we could say that the Europeans are a bit late on this. We're working on it. We have industrial partners who are at the forefront in terms of what is atmospheric and exo-atmospheric, and that is an old debate in terms of anti-missile defense. But in terms of how we coordinate this in Europe, with a lot of dissent between the French and Germans, with a very political take from the Germans in terms of the multi-layer European shield, where in France we would have liked to have had more say. In fact, the Europeans have some strong points. We have never stopped discussing this because there is a triangulation between anti-missile defense, military space, and deterrence. And in France, for functional reasons, we have had to work across all directions. So we have know-how and skills, but at a political level, we've not managed to come together to be able to be autonomous in this sphere. So anti-missile defense needs to remain a priority for the years to come. And we want this to be not just an anti-missile defense system for Europe, but for an anti-missile defense which Europeans have greater control of, especially in terms of future orientations and in terms of decision-making. And we are very far from that in terms of joint command and control centers and early warning systems and so on. I know that Eloise has worked on this to add to what Oliver just said. We are publishing something tomorrow about the European Sky Initiative, and I think it is fundamentally a question of perception and even the term of shield, which is incorrect, because we know, of course, that it is impossible to protect ourselves from all of the threats, whether it's from rockets, long-range artillery, ballistic missiles, or cruise missiles. But we can understand what is attractive in this solution, which is mostly a political and industrial solution, which has been promoted by Germany, which is advocating for a change in monetary policy. So before waiting for European solutions, they have preferred to buy from America and also from Israel, which has generated tensions, because you cannot, on the one side, want to promote European sovereignty and then buy outside of Europe. But then it is mostly a question of perception. We cannot be defensive against a country which wants to create a kind of a bubble, where at the same time France is one of these countries which is promoting this NATO mix with the nuclear deterrent, deep strike capabilities, and also an anti-missile defense. And then the Israeli example, which we have seen since October, a misunderstanding of the functioning of this anti-air and ballistic missile defense in Israel, because the size of the country is nothing compared to Europe. Israel is about the size of Brittany. So if we wanted to protect Brittany, I think the Bretons would be delighted that would be possible. However, we cannot protect all of Europe. It would be far too expensive as a system. Then we need to maintain these systems. You also have the early warning radars, the stocks. I was mentioning it earlier, and that's why there are misunderstandings with regard to air defense and missile defense, which means that the Israeli model cannot be duplicated in Europe. And yes, of course, we would need an Iron Dome in Europe. No, that is just impossible. However, in France, we know that there are strategic sites to be protected, and we're talking about air bases, and they are protected with ballistic missiles, and it is this continuity of the spectrum with the highest level threats which will be covered by the nuclear deterrent. And I think we mentioned it in the roundtable yesterday. The rest will be treated with conventional systems, and then I think there is a role for multi-layer defense. And what is certain is that we will not be able to implement a complete nuclear shield in Europe because it does not exist. I think now we need to ask the General to conclude and to thank all three of you for your brilliant interventions and the extremely direct way in which you have agreed to address these difficult topics. So, Sarah, as a conclusion, what would be your greatest desire? Well, first of all, thank you very much for having allowed us to talk about our various worries, because defense of France is defense of everyone. It does not just concern the army. It is not a technical affair. It is an affair of the nation. A nation who accepts its defense has greater chances of defeating the opponent. A nation which believes that it is no longer so ambitious in its defense will have frailties which can be exploited by the opponent, especially in terms of in the fields of perceptions and misinformation. So I thank you a lot for having taken part in this dialogue and to have shown your interest for your support to national defense.